this activity, or part of making this activity real. I think that Callie, when she talks to you all about the contextualization of this, will do some of the more formal thank yous. But I did want to make sure that I thank the speakers for coming and for sharing your work with us. I also wanted to thank the Dean of Cause for coming and supporting her people, which is great. And I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge the food was here because of Amanda. And I think that Callie will refer to that as well. So I don't want to stretch things out too much. I'm just glad that you all are here, and I hope you learn lots. I know I always do. And I will turn it over to Callie.
Hi everyone, can everybody hear me okay? So my name is Callie Murata, and I'm a faculty member in the writing program and a member of the Writing Across the Curriculum committee that is putting together this event. For those of you who can't see me, I'm a white woman with short brown hair, a gray shirt, and a purple scarf, and I probably look very tired, but happy to be here. This event grew out of work and care of many, many people. Amanda Thompson, our program director and wizard behind all of our events, the brilliant researchers and all the people who have given their time and stories working with them, Sheila Carter-Todd, our executive director and chair of the Writing Across the Curriculum committee, and Camilla Kenyon-Kushash, who was dreaming up this event back in September, and Richard Colby for filming. Thank you. We also thank all the people who clean and take care of spaces like these so we can put on events. We want you all to be able to access all the information today, so please use the space in any way that's comfortable for you and let us know if there is anything we can do to help. My job today is to speak directly to students in RIT 1133 who might not be exactly sure how or why they're here, but their teachers urge them to be so. Today, your teachers want you to see incredible research in action, facilitated by real people with real stakes, approached in a variety of ways we call methods. But this question is really best answered by students themselves. So Ana Julia Rodriguez Alves, a student researcher on access discrimination, says, "Research matters to me because it brings attention to real-world issues and helps us better understand and confront societal biases in education. Through our research, I've gained a deeper understanding of how profoundly these issues affect individuals and communities. It was also incredibly meaningful to educate and share insights with my community about a struggle that often goes unnoticed. To me, research is not only a tool for increasing awareness, but also a catalyst for social change and advancing educational equity. Of course, research doesn't have to do good, and historically it often hasn't. In my RIT 1133 class, we followed disability justice scholars in asking for research led by the most impacted. Maybe that's your family, your friends, or you. A student in my current class, Carlos Romero Lopez, says he wants to share his story as a part of research to help others feel seen. So today, I want you to know that your stories are not separate from research, they are essential to it. We need more people researching with and being led by you. Whether you are communicating through numbers or words, we need you to ask the questions that move you and listen closely to the answers. We hope today, as you listen to this amazing scholarship, you begin to see a place for yourself in research. Thank you.
I'm Camilla Kenyon-Kushash. Thank you, Callie, for that wonderful introduction and for acknowledging all of the people who have made this event possible. So I'd like to now introduce our speakers. We'll hear first from Professor Jesse Acevedo from the Department of Political Science. He uses quantitative methods to study immigration from Central America and Latino communities in the US. He'll be talking today about how he designs surveys for use among hard-to-reach populations or in politically challenging environments. Our next speaker will be Professor Rebecca Galemba, an anthropologist and member of the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies. She has conducted research about the Mexico-Guatemala border, as well as conditions for immigrant day laborers in Colorado. She'll discuss her qualitative and mixed methods ethnographic research and will illustrate the characteristics of ethnographic writing with its emphasis on storytelling and personal perspectives. And then we will hear from history professor Trishula Patel. I had the opportunity to recently interview Dr. Patel and to learn about the oral history interviews that she has conducted with the descendants of Indian migrants in Zimbabwe. Her research embodies how interview-based qualitative methods can be effectively combined with text-based archival methods and how this contributes to our knowledge of history. After the 3 talks, we'll invite you to ask questions and we'll have an informal discussion. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody who has made this event possible, and right now I'd like to welcome Professor Jesse Acevedo.
Hi, good afternoon. Everyone hear me all right? Cool. Thank you. So yeah, I'll talk about I'll talk about my research trajectory as it relates to the methods I use. So some background is that I was trained in quantitative methods in grad school, and I've been interested in the effects of immigration on the origin country. So while 80%, 90% of the research is about how immigration affects the politics of the destination country, may it be the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom, I'm more interested in the countries people are leaving from. And that on its own provides a set of challenges. One, that I'm a quantitative researcher and there's just not a lot of data on there. So there's already challenges off the bat. Typically what, as grad students would do, is you take off-the-shelf data from established centers, whether that's the Latin American Public Opinion Project based in Vanderbilt, or the Latino Barometro based in Chile. However, you're limited because you yourself didn't design the survey. That's one. And two, many of these surveys that are off the shelf were meant to be nationally representative. And if you're interested in studying a phenomena that impacts relatively less people, you run into several issues in terms of inference, whether that's descriptive inference or just statistical power on its own. So when I arrived to DU and received some resources to do my own research, I thought, you know what, I need to do my own survey to really answer the questions that I have. And the main question that I've had since I was a grad student is, how do people actually respond when people leave? It's kind of like how if you're at a party, say you're at a party like tonight, and you start seeing people leave the party, how do you feel about that party? Probably think that party's whack, right? Like, no, I'm serious. If you see a bunch of people leaving the party, you thought you were having a good time, but then you see other people leave, you're like, maybe I should leave this party as well. Or you update your opinion about how this party is going. So this is kind of like the framework that influences my research. And this comes from a seminal essay by Albert Hirschman on East Germany about the fall of the Berlin Wall and how immigration may have contributed to the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I used the resources that I had to execute some surveys, design and execute surveys in Honduras and El Salvador. One thing about surveys, they're very expensive. And typically people partner with big marketing firms or established survey firms, but they're really expensive. So, going with my contacts that I had in these countries, they led me to universities. And one of the cool things from this experience is that I partnered with universities in Central America, the National University of Honduras and Francisco Gavidia in El Salvador. And I had 2 different projects there, and I do want to emphasize, when you do survey work, yes, I started to have control of the survey I wanted to do and the design I wanted to do, but I don't control the universe. I'm still at the whims of what's going on in these countries. So, for example, in Honduras, I was interested in what the effect of the caravans were going to be for the upcoming elections. So for those that may not remember, migrant caravans departed from Honduras from 2018, and it was thousands of people that left Honduras. And the reason that motivated me to do this project is because I saw the analogies to East Berlin in 1989. So I wanted to think about how could I study this and the effects of the upcoming elections, and I chose to do a survey experiment, which is a very popular method in political science, in where I designed different surveys and I randomized who gets that survey, and each of them is going to have a different treatment. So I don't want to go too much into the details of that project, but what was going on the ground in my conversations with my contacts in Honduras, and it was several things that I learned a lot. One, obviously, I speak Spanish, I can read and write in Spanish, but when designing a survey, something that like I didn't expect and I should have, is that there are subtleties in the type of Spanish, because you really have to consider who's reading that survey. So most of the Spanish that you're taught at university is typically going to be Castellano Spanish from Spain, or from one of the big countries like Mexico. But coming from Central America, there's some subtleties that I had to consider in terms of asking people about things, right? So that's one. Another is that I wanted to field this survey before the election. And the concerns that we had, this was 2021, so we still had to think about COVID restrictions and the health of the respondent and the enumerators. We had to consider that, we had to accept that we can't do a nationally representative survey because parts of Honduras are difficult to do surveys due to high levels of political violence. So we had to strategize and think about, okay, what's the best possible sample we can collect? And we went ahead of doing regional samples with different parts of Honduras, and it was up to me to do the reweighing and the statistical work afterwards. But we were kind of a little concerned about whether people would actually do the survey, because asking people about politics is not easy. You can't expect people, one, to be sincere. People often won't be truthful in their responses. So I had to design the question in a way that would elicit a sincere response. I had to consider the length of the survey, the language of the survey, so I had to be careful with things like, who do you want to vote for? What do you think of the incumbent? Because these are actually sensitive questions at a time of high political violence and political uncertainty. We pulled it off, and one cool thing about working with universities is that it gave like jobs to students. They were able to make some income. Fielding this survey, they got training that could help them down the line after they graduate. So that was really cool in terms of working with the university down there. And it was successful. The effects I found is that when people are exposed to information about the migrant caravan, it boosted voter turnout. And I'm like matching that with actual election numbers, and I'm seeing something similar. But notice that like there's a lot of things that I couldn't control. You just can't control the world. So you have to keep that in mind when doing these type of projects. Fast forward, a year later, I want to do another project in El Salvador. And I was interested in, well, what affects presidential popularity? There's a debate as to whether my people leaving decreases presidential popularity, or it's the other way around, where low popularity is a signal that people should leave. So in political science, we often think about this causal direction, and I use survey experiments to fix that causal direction. And El Salvador presented other challenges. Probably a lot of you have heard of this country in the last couple weeks. El Salvador is a country I'm very well familiar with. My family's from there. I go there frequently. And I wanted to do a project on how Salvadorans react to their fellow country people being detained at the border, and who do they blame? I wanted to know, do they blame the local incumbent president if their fellow citizens are being detained at the US-Mexico border? So I designed a survey experiment and to kind of manipulate the treatment, which was the number of adults being detained at the border and the number of children being detained at the border, and whether that would weaken presidential approval. So for those who don't know, Nayib Bukele is the president of El Salvador, who has had high approval ratings that don't seem to drop, even though it's basically an authoritarian regime at this point. And things were going fine, things were kind of going well logistically until a month before we had planned to execute the survey. He puts in the state of exception. So for those who don't know what a state of exception is, that's basically martial law. You suspend civil rights, and El Salvador's been under this state of exception since March of 2022. So I had to go back to my survey and read every single question and ask myself, would a respondent answer truthfully? Would they respond truthfully? Would they be scared of answering this question? So it delayed the execution of this survey, and this was in our minds quite a bit during this project is, are the enumerators safe and are the respondents safe? So we had to ask around, and we agreed that it was safe. Granted, this was just a couple months into the state of exception. I don't think I could do this survey right now. But at that time, we felt that we were confident that we could. So notice, once again, you really have to consider the context that you're working in. And I had to remove several words from the survey because I didn't want to bring up the president's name. I didn't want to bring up particular policies, so I had to just cut them from the survey. As much as I wanted them in there, I had to cut them. So we created a survey that would be friendly in a way. By friendly is inviting people to respond to them. And fortunately, it worked. The survey experiment worked. We were very happy with the results. Some of the results were very surprising. We found that, yeah, presidential approval does go down when migrants are detained at the border, but not for children. That was the big surprise, that Salvadorans don't blame the president when children are migrating. They blame them when adults are migrating. So notice that you really don't know, you can't anticipate what's going to happen, so you really have to go back, revise, and that's okay because research is never linear. You're constantly going back and forth. But what helps the process is you got to stay true to your research question and the hypotheses you want to test. As long as you remain consistent with those things throughout the process, it really helps the project move along. So that's my survey work in Central America. The second piece that was mentioned is in the last 2 years, I've been thinking a lot about Latinos in the United States and how they look at Latin America. So here are 2 projects I'll talk about in brief. These are very recent, done in the past year. I study Latin America, and I study people leaving Latin America. And I have a lot of colleagues who study Latinos and immigrants in the United States. And there's been this growing interest in political science of what explains conservative attitudes amongst Latinos, what could be explaining this shift to Republican voting. And for decades now, people have always thought about it has to do with the country they come from. If you come from Cuba, you're going to vote Republican. But I've been quite skeptical of that literature. And my colleague and I were wondering, well, a lot of this literature assumes that Latin Americans don't know anything about Latin America after they migrate. You leave Latin America and you're done. It's kind of like you as an alumni, you leave DU and you don't know how the hockey team is doing next year. But you might notice what the hockey team is doing next year, even though you're not at DU. So it's kind of like that's the analogy, right? So we wanted to do this survey, and the challenge with studying Latinos in the United States is you rarely get a representative sample. This is why many scholars are always skeptical of polls about Latinos every election cycle, because those samples are not representative. So my colleague and I were like, well, we really want to know whether information about Latin America affects Latino views on politics. So there's often a trade-off that we have in this work where if we can't get a representative sample, we need to nail the experiment. And we did a conjoint experiment where we manipulate the type of information you receive as to whether that affects your views on democracy and US politics. And we were very influenced by our childhoods. This project was fun in many ways because we were very influenced by our childhoods. Like, this project started from a conversation that we had in a conference in Puerto Rico like 6 years ago now. So this is how long research takes. 6 years ago, we had a conversation We're like, why are our parents so conservative on Latin American politics but so liberal on US politics? And it was just a casual conversation. And over the years, we talked back and forth, and then we eventually developed a theory and a hypothesis, and we're like, let's test it. And it took us probably 2 years to design it alone. And when we finally launched it, we were nervous because it was like, was this survey too complicated for people? And this is something that you have constantly put in the position of the respondent, because as readers, as college students, we kind of take things for granted how things are worded. But like, whenever you read something, consider how many rewrites a paragraph has gone through, a sentence has gone through. Writing a survey question is the same thing. We probably rewrote that survey 50 times until we finally settled on it. So think of it like, when you watch a movie, they always talk about the director's cut. If you listen to music, you don't know how many verses were cut from it. So this is something about research that I think, like, as newcomers, we struggle with. Like, you create this piece of art, your craft, and you're very hesitant to cut it here and there. But you may have to, in order to get like this sculpture, the final product. And even though the survey sample is not perfect, it was well executed. Which leads me to my last example. I wanted to study the Salvadoran diaspora and their views on abortion, which is another big question that scholars have about Latinos. And I want to thank SIPR because they set up a breakfast where I met someone that motivated the project. And I also want to thank Professor Mascot for funding this. And so we went to El Salvador, and doing this survey took probably a year to design, because you just can't assume things are easily translatable. You can learn another language, but you can't assume certain topics are easily translatable. So one of the questions I had for the group is, how do you translate miscarriage in Spanish? Because this is an important part of the project, because in El Salvador, miscarriage is punishable with jail. Like, women go to jail up to 40 years for a miscarriage. But the term miscarriage doesn't easily translate to Spanish. So in doing this survey, we went back and forth on what type of language do I have to use to get that message across. So that's one. When you're dealing with sensitive topics, really think about the language. And because you don't want to scare away your respondents. You really want to hold on to your respondents' attention as much as you can. So this is why testing is so important. And getting that sample was not easy. I can't rely on established pollsters. I called a couple pollsters that I know. I asked them, how many Salvadorans can you get and how much? It wasn't worth it. It was too expensive, so I used Facebook sampling. I put an ad on Facebook and Instagram to invite people to a survey. My sister helped me design the graphic, and it worked. It worked. Granted, I had to do some waiting, but it worked, and we've had some incredible results here that were just eye-opening. But once again, it's not something you wake up and do. It's a process. And even the little things that you may take for granted could really change the scope of your research. So I guess I want to end it with, like, if you're interested in doing research, just don't write a question. Like, ask your friends, does this work? How do you read this question? Was this confusing? Like, with the abortion survey, I literally gave it to my dad. And it was like, okay, how does an old Salvadoran male read this? Then I asked my sister, how does a young US-born Salvadoran woman read this? Like, I tested it with friends, family, pilots, because the thing about surveys is, because of the cost, you just have that one shot. And you better hope it works, because you may not get a second chance. Once again, I don't think I could do this survey right now, given how toxic Salvadoran social media is. So I was really happy to do that, and this is a project that's I'm really happy with because of all the support I got here at DU to make this project happen.
Hey, I'm Rebecca Galemba. I'm at the Korbel School. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Immigration Policy and Research. We have some stickers up front. I carry them everywhere I go. So if you'd like one, there's a few you can take one. My work's a little different than most people at Korbel because I'm an anthropologist. Although some of you have obviously taken courses in anthropology. I've also have some training in anthropological demography, where I've also been in the room with quantitative folks like Jesse. So I can also talk about some of how I've integrated that into my own work as well. I primarily identify as someone who's an ethnographer, so I'll tell you what that is, because most people are like, what is that? I don't really understand that. There's also a lot of misconceptions, and then I'll talk about how that infuses the kind of ways that not only I do my research, but also the ways that we write about our research, as I was told to kind of share some examples of that. So if I have time, I have a couple of vignettes from this book, Labor and for Justice, which is my work with immigrant day laborers here, just to give an example. Okay, so what do ethnographers do anyway? So again, the whole idea is to have direct experience with people in their social context, often increasing something called reactivity, right? When the researcher is present or you ask a question, people often want to answer in the way that they think that you want to hear the answer, right? Or they want to please you, or they have a particular agenda, or they might just forget, right? Or something else kind of comes up. Or context, as we argue, is really important for how people actually shape your behavior. A lot of the hallmark of an ethnographic approach is trying to get at the differences between what people say and what people do, and why that might be important. So again, stressing this whole idea of being there, and often being there over time, right? Knowing that at first no one's probably going to talk to you, right? And be able to come back over time to establish rapport and also see change over time. And one of my favorite examples that I always give my students about the ethnographic approach was actually when I was in college. And I remember our college was doing an alcohol survey. And so they would ask the students, it was like a quick survey when they came into the dining hall, about kind of their drinking habits. Like how many drinks do you have, per day, per week, things like that. It was anonymous, it was on paper, nobody saw what the students responded. At the end, you got a water bottle, and I can tell you what most people did with the water bottle afterwards. Okay? My question is, do people respond to those accurately? Right? What other data do you need? Sometimes to really understand why people might drink, under what context do they drink, or overdrink, or not want to talk about their drinking, even when it's completely anonymous, right? So this idea that there's a social desirability effect sometimes, right? So if you're someone who doesn't drink, but you're kind of embarrassed about that, you might, put one or two. If you're someone who's like, oh, I drink too much, like these kind of self-conscious things, right? Even when no one knows that it's yours, you might not want to say that you had like 5 drinks a day, right? And so an ethnographic approach is really getting at why sometimes there is that discrepancy between what people may say and what people may do, and sometimes it's just your habits. There was another study that I remember a professor told me about, where they were trying to figure out why so many doctors and people in the hospitals were getting sick, and they were trying to figure it out. And they asked all the doctors, you wash your hands, right, before you come in, and of course, everybody says yes. Once they started observing, right, what people were doing in the course of the day, they realized it wasn't always true, right? But we oftentimes, again, respond not because of any nefarious intent, because we're in a rush and we assume like, well, of course I wash my hands, right? That's something that I always do, right? So getting at those differences. I like this particular meme, which is not actually supposed to be for this, which I thought was really funny that no one actually critiqued this. I forget, it was just for a user desirability study. And I actually think it illustrates it perfectly, because this guy on the left is obviously really, really frustrated, right? And so then afterwards, they're like, oh, on a scale of 1 to 5, like how easy was it? He was like, oh, it was fine. Right? But obviously that's not how he felt in the moment, right? And ethnographers are really seeking to get at that differences. People think we only do qualitative research. I would say mostly, but not necessarily entirely. So again, the idea of field research is often being where people are at and understanding people's behaviors, actions, thoughts, as they are going about those experiences in daily life. So again, the context of meaning making within the context that is actually occurring. So many ethnographers, we do interviews, we do a lot of what's called participant observation. So again, being there, but also being a participant and reflecting on that role, mapping of certain areas. Some also do archival research, depending on the kind of information. And yes, sometimes we also look at quantitative data, which surprises some people, but we do. And I can talk about how we did that for my wage theft study as well, because they really do get at different types of questions, and I think can be really helpful in certain contexts together. What we also do is look often balancing the emic which are insider perspectives of how people are analyzing and making sense of their experiences and their social worlds, with your kind of edict hat, which is your outsider kind of analysis lens of, honoring the words that people say, but understanding the context of why they might say that, right? And understanding there's a lot of, for example, ethnographic and anthropological work that's really about understanding things like structural violence, right? Or the internalization, right, of oppression, right? So maybe many quotes, for example, and I do this a lot in the book with day laborers that have experienced wage theft, and these are very vulnerable immigrant workers. And there are many, you ask them why that happens, and they're like, well, because people just didn't work very hard. Right? Like, do you take that for face value to really explore why people might be saying that, right? Kind of what are the conditions that lead people sometimes to internalize, right? This is individual failings rather than these structural problems and forms of violence that get pushed onto the most vulnerable people. So again, why we balance why people say what they do with our analysis as well. I really like this particular meme because everyone's like, well, is that ethnography or you're just hanging out? We used to have these jokes in my demography classes in grad school where it was a strange mix of, it was sociologists, economists, and anthropologists, right? Which kind of sounds like, a priest rabbi, going to a bar, right? And, they would always joke with us, like, you just sit around and talk with people. And we're like, you just play with numbers, right? And obviously both of those are stereotypes. But to a sense, yes, we're hanging out with people where the action is, but having a keen observer's lens to that, being very transparent with who you are and what you're doing is really important in terms of ethics and reflecting on their position. So in a lot of ethnographic work, like the researchers in the book all the time, right? Their conversations or dialogue or just the context of how they come upon the data. So you can also see how they're influencing, right? How people are responding to and why they might tell somebody something and not somebody else, for example. So about 100 students worked on this project, and I'll tell you, obviously, they often responded to young women college students, sometimes different than young men, right? Or depending on also their demographics as well. Sometimes, again, they would share certain things or stress certain things versus others. But again, there's this kind of stereotypes, and it's just stories, right? It's just anecdotes, and I'll talk about again, some of the ways that we can think about that actually can be very systematic. In fact, by being there and triangulating different kinds of methods is where we build our validity. So, I have some examples from my work where, well, even with the day laborers, right, if I were just to have one-on-one interviews, I would get a lot of people's individual stories and be able to really understand what they were thinking, right? Whereas you think like, oh, somebody else coming up to you on the street and interrupting your interview, right, is actually breaking, right? It's kind of interrupting that flow. And to an extent, that's true. But sometimes those are actually the most analytically insightful things that happen. Is then, again, sometimes people will tell you something in a private setting, right? But then what actually happens when they're faced with that situation in practice and being able to triangulate that? And we have many examples that ends up being actually a common theme in the book that we work through in stories. As I'll be standing with a worker and he'll be, how do you prevent wage theft? And he'll be, well, the only people who fall for that are, doing this, and you have to ask for this, and you have to ask for that, and you don't go anyone, who's everyone's saying that else to go to, all these things that they know. Like, I know what I'm not supposed to do. And then 10 minutes later, you see him get in the truck and do none of those things, right? What's going on there, right? You know everything you're supposed to do, right? You say this has never happened to you, and then I'm actually seeing you make an entirely different decision, right, when faced with that really quintessential difficult opportunity cost of asking too many questions of these employers who drive by might mean I don't get that job that day, right? So they know what they should do, but often why don't they do that, right? So we build our validity by looking, again, often by triangulating around different kinds of methods. And again, ethnographic or a lot of qualitative approaches are really good for understanding the why. Sorry, I should say how. What does it mean? Shared cultural meaning as well. But I'd say it's not good for questions of how much or how prevalent is this, or the distribution of individual level behaviors, or to answer causal questions. It's not very good at doing that, and hence why for this project, we actually had worked with a demographer to have a survey of workers so we could see, like we found all these kind of we knew kind of how waste should happen, why it happened, why despite knowing what they should do, workers often were vulnerable and hesitant, right, to assert their rights. But we didn't really know how common some of these strategies were, or how many people, right, were impacted in a way that could influence policymakers, right? So it really actually helped to put that together. The other issue I think that was really helpful to know is that we had a really select sample, right? We had people willing to share their stories with us, but we were interviewing people at street corner hiring sites, okay? Which means that if they're out there looking for a job, they're not working, right? They're not working, they don't have any exposure to wage theft. So how do you kind of deal with those issues where we still had meaningful data, right? But we didn't know, for example, if we were just speaking to perhaps the unlucky people, right? The people who weren't likely to work in the first place, right? And how that would impact things. And so the way we designed the survey and the sampling strategy, which took a lot of the ethnographic research to even figure out how to do on a population where nobody really knows the population parameter or distribution, to really be able to approximate a better, I wouldn't say quite representative, but as close to as we could, to really kind of test some of these questions that we already knew a lot about in terms of ethnographic research. And then when we got some of the findings back, we're like, oh, that's weird. And so we actually have an article I wrote with the demographer where we went back and started looking at the qualitative data and also talking to workers again to try to kind of parse out why we were finding some of the things in the survey that hadn't necessarily come up with the qualitative portions of the data. And again, ethnographers also do generate theory, right? It's not just anecdotes and storytelling, but we approach it really differently. So they often come in with a research question or a hypothesis, but the idea is that it's constantly reevaluated and tested against the data. And so we often will tell people doing ethnographic research, like if you came out saying like, my hypothesis is right, then you probably didn't do the research, because most ethnographers, if you're doing a survey, that's very different, or if you're working in a more kind of positivist framework. But if you're doing kind of ethnographic research, it's almost expected that you're gonna reformulate your question or even your hypothesis, and sometimes your whole entire project as you're doing it, because you're learning as you are going. And I'll say one of the most difficult skills to tell students, and this is something I'm working on, is like very, very fastidious note-taking, like the amounts of information required to really helping make sense and try to, again, not knowing necessarily what's important until you actually are exposed to it. So again, I like this text. It's actually by qualitative sociologists of what actually makes good qualitative writing. And they actually have this book called Qualitative Literacy, which it's, how do you speak back to those who say like, your sample's too small, right? Or how do you know this? And how do you judge when that's actually true, right? Versus what actually is good quality qualitative research. And I think this goes to design and also goes into writing, right? How do you convince people you know what you know, that they should buy your argument, right? Or why, again, we often do tell stories to largely illuminate a larger trend or a larger theme or something that's an ideal case or an ideal discrepancy or something that's really meaningful, even if it's not statistically significant, but we're intentionally choosing those, right? We're not just cherry picking them or just using one journalistic story because we've only interviewed one person. There's plenty of ethnographic texts about one person or about a handful of people, but it's often based on a larger corpus of research about how do we understand or make people understand the lived experience by telling one person's story. Or I've had in my book telling one story about two groups of men in Mexico and Guatemala fighting over gasoline smuggling, right? What do we learn from that particular incident, right? Of the kind of social factors within the community, as well as the larger kind of political factors going on in Mexico, the gasoline crisis that was happening at the moment, challenges over who controlled the border when it was being increasingly infiltrated, right, by cartels and the military, right? All of these things kind of encapsulate within this one little conflict between men fighting over who was going to control the smuggling of gasoline. And so things that they suggest there is, again, it's about quality over quantity, again, depending what you're looking at. And so if someone's only it's not just a number of interviews, but it's kind of the amount of depth that you've gone into with those. And again, picking that sample would often depend on the issue of interest. But saturation is often, again, or theoretical saturation is when you start to find the same things or you're no longer surprising yourself. And you can also test yourself. I've done different kinds of methods or questions where I try to, as I'm proceeding in research, where I think I've got it, right? So you could kind of ask people the opposite, see if they'll contradict you, right? Trying to find that. But again, the kind of the quality necessarily versus the quantity. And again, this idea of intentional selection, and things that they talk about is exposure, right? So this idea that you have a lot of data to choose from, so people can get, your readers can get a sense of your exposure to understand how you've selected the examples or quotes or stories that you choose. Another thing is if the research of the text shows cognitive empathy, like you kind of understand the meaning, like we trust you to interpret the meaning, right, out of the stories that you're telling. Heterogeneity, right? Is there a difference, right, within that? They're not just telling all one story, right, or all one viewpoint, or all cases are the same. We're unlikely to trust that you maybe just selected for that, right, and didn't actually try to see if there was some variation in this. Palpability, and that's always when I stress to students, is a concrete presentation of data, which comes through an either thick description or using people's words, right, in dialogue without, so we can get a sense, right, of what people actually said versus just a summary of what they said or a synopsis, but really giving people that texture so they can feel, right, the presence of that and also trust you as an author of why you have chosen and why that follows your argument. The ability to follow up, right, going back and testing these ideas over time, as well as researcher self-awareness. And again, there's a lot of influence in ethnography and in anthropology specifically, and much of sociology, about the positionality of the researcher and critical reflexivity, right? Where it's not only about the researcher, but again, they are part of shaping, right, what you're interested in the first place, what people tell you, how they react to you, as well as how you're interpreting that situation. Okay. How much time do I have? Because I can give an example if I have time.
Yeah, we'd like an example.
Okay, I can give you one example. Well, this one I'll do quick, but then I'll go into an actual text. So this is actually from an article as well as a chapter in my book where I was actually trying again, and so we do a lot of methods experimentation sometimes in the field where like, I think I'm seeing something, what's the best way to understand that, right? How do I kind of, now that I've kind of known the social setting, and I kept seeing all this corn being trucked over the border, just kind of, okay, go on. And people tell me, oh, it's because we got free trade. And I said, well, this is kind of strange. So, well, maybe happening in the light of day, nobody's hiding it. There is a free trade agreement, but that's not what it means, right? And so this kind of opened up this whole approach of figuring out, like, why are people allowed to do this? Why do they think it's free trade? Are they being ironic? Are they actually conflating it? Because what I realized is that the official free trade agreement, when in effect the same time that people had to rely on smuggling their corn because the Mexican government wasn't buying it anymore, but they weren't really informed about what free trade was. So they, heard one thing on the radio, and they were pushing to smuggle their corn to the local officials on, the other side. And so a lot of people just conflated it at the time. But part of the way that I tell this story in the book is actually by going with, someone that I had become friendly with at the border, of like, how does this work? And so I just use that one incident to tell this whole story that has to do with how people actually experienced the free trade agreement, how they heard about it, how they misinterpreted it, and then how that fit into their lives of smuggling corn across the border, and a lot of their anxieties about actually doing that work. And so which is basically the chapter is going with him to go pick up the corn, right, that he's supposed to buy. It's in a different area where there's actually better corn, about 20 minutes away from where he lives, and the amount of kind of intermediaries that it goes through to get to Guatemala. We went to look at his last load that hadn't sold in Guatemala, and so it basically takes the reader on that whole journey to look at, again, that whole process through the lens of just how do you truck corn, right, from the river zone of Chiapas, Mexico, across the border where it sits in this little bodega where this kid, right, is eating, I don't know what he's eating here, maybe a bag of chips, right, hoping that they're going to buy it in time so he's not broke and can buy more across the border. And so that kind of tells that particular story of following a thing, as well as this concept that I really didn't quite understand, and I got some of that through interviews, but I couldn't only get it through interviews. And some of it was also going through all newspaper records or asking, finding the oldest people in the town. Be like, can you tell me what happened here? Like, when everyone's saying this happened, were you the, municipal president there? Like, what did happen? And kind of trying to track, right, that through time and different methods. The few different stories from the book, I think I'll just tell one really quick. Claudio's story I just use as a lead-in because it's a typical story, but let me see if I want to do that one. And then I have that one. I'm not going to probably go into that. I have Miguel's story, which I think is interesting. Maybe could I tell that one? tell parts of it? Okay, so this is just one little section in like a background chapter of my book, which is like this. It doesn't look like a background chapter. It's basically telling the story of why many immigrant workers or day laborers in Denver, like why so many of them we spoke to were kind of in their 50s, had been here over 20 years, in and out of precarious work, in the context of a post-recession construction boom, kind of what's going on here, and kind of setting that context of what do immigration dynamics look like, what does the city look like, what does development and construction look like, and what does Mexican immigration look like now that's kind of shaping this context. And so I just used his own little biography, and this was from an interview with him, but it's interspersed with some other things in the book, to just actually give the story of like, what does the changing migration dynamics after the Great Recession look like in a place like Colorado. So I'll just tell a story, try to do it pretty briefly. So one morning in mid-March, Miguel was still hanging around Centro, which is Denver's worker center, although he hadn't found a job. Centro's morning employment lottery had ended 2 hours ago, and employers had stopped coming through the doors to look for workers. Miguel commented, "Now I am resting because there's no work." In the past, he might have tried his luck across the street at Stout Street site, yet he was less concerned about needing to hustle, he said, because he no longer needed to send money to his wife or his children in Mexico, as he had in the past. They had moved on. Quote, "My children are grown now, they don't need me anymore. They are married and can take care of themselves. Now I'm living for myself," he explained. Workers like Miguel often stuck around until Centro closed, even though it's primarily a place where people are just looking for jobs. In the early afternoon to chat, pass the time, use the lockers or computers, stay warm, or cook a meal in the kitchenette. Miguel first arrived to the United States in 2002. He was advancing in age, and immigration enforcement and the recession had altered both his migratory plans and his employment prospects. In 2002, he migrated from Juarez, Mexico, just over the border from El Paso, Texas, to Denver. On this first trip, he worked for a roofing company for 6 years. For the past 5 years, however, he depended on searching for day labor jobs at Centro. Miguel had lost his job at the roofing company in 2008 as a result of the Great Recession. He recalled, "After came the crisis, they let me go, and so I went back to Mexico." Miguel spent a year back in Juarez, but quickly realized there was little for him there. For me, because I'm already old, there's no work in Juarez, just for the young people. Miguel was able to return to the United States in 2010 because his tourist visa was still current. However, the visa was only valid for 6 months and then expired. "Now I can no longer return," he mentioned. He was implying that if he returned to Mexico, it'd be unlikely he could ever come back to the United States because recrossing the border without documentation had become prohibitively expensive and dangerous. In Denver, Miguel was living with a woman who was sort of his girlfriend, but it was more of a relationship of convenience. He admitted, "It's just so I'm not suffering in the street here, and she understands because she doesn't want to be alone." He no longer had a relationship with his ex-wife in Juarez, he realized, who had just been spending and spending. He trusted only his mother, who also lived in Juarez, and he sent her money to save for his return. Miguel was planning to return to Juarez the following year. He commented wistfully, "Because I no longer want to be here in the United States. I came here to work, not to live. I don't like it. I'm old now." When Miguel worked for the roofing company on his first migration trip, he had a regular salary that increased from $8 an hour to $14.50 by the time he was let go. He could no longer work for companies he had in the past because he lacked immigration papers. He explained the rules have changed. "Before, when I entered with the roofing company, I had fake papers, but then I looked for work. You know there are new rules, and they no longer accept those. You know this too, right?" He had noticed a change about 3 or 4 years ago, as he told me. They, the US government, began to investigate the companies that employ people without papers. And many of these workers talk about E-Verify actually changing a lot of their circumstances around this time. Miguel had few remaining options outside day labor or the repeat informal employers who might call him. And then I kind of sum it up, where Miguel's story highlights 3 changes that impinge on the economic prospects of unauthorized immigrant workers. These changes have led the unauthorized, and this is a quote from other scholars, the unauthorized immigrant population in the US, at least at the time, to be increasingly made up of longer-term residents like Miguel. First, the escalating militarization of the US-Mexico border since the 1990s, and especially after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, raised the risk of crossing the border, which led migrants to increasingly rely on smugglers who charge higher fees. These inflated costs motivated migrants who may have previously returned home after encountering low-wage, high-risk, insecure employment in US labor markets to remain longer to justify the migratory sacrifice and debts incurred. Like Miguel, as they prolonged their stays in the United States, some of their emotional and financial ties to their employers back home frayed. And later I talk about also how this coincided with the Great Recession as well. But just to give you an idea, again, telling a story to kind of show these wider kind of dynamics going on and how they influence one person's individual trajectory.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great, okay. I'm going to pivot a little bit. I'm going to move to an entirely different part of the world. And we're going to move to a completely different discipline, which actually still uses a lot of the methods that both of our previous speakers have talked about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research methodologies, specifically in the Global South, and how that might look different from doing sort of research here in the United States. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my book, which is coming out next year, the title which is Becoming Zimbabwean, A History of Indians in Rhodesia. For those of you that might not know, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, is a country in southern Africa. It's right above South Africa. It's a little teapot-shaped country. And it is the country that my own great-grandfathers migrated to at the beginning of the 20th century. So my family have now been in the country. They migrated over from Gujarat in India, and they have been there now for 4 generations, actually. And the past 3 generations have all been born in Zimbabwe. And so my book sort of set out to explore not just the migration process, but what it meant to move from one former British colony to another. Zimbabwe was a former British colony that gained independence in 1980. And what that meant then for immigrants to move to a place and no longer be a diaspora, but to become African, to become Zimbabwean, and a part of that new country, right? My trajectory was sort of a little unconventional in that I never imagined I would be here in this moment. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, then I thought I was going to be a journalist, and eventually I realized what I was meant to be doing all along was telling the history of my family and my community. This stemmed from a personal identity crisis that comes from childhood. As a migrant here to the United States, I always get asked the question, where are you from? This is a question that I had been thinking about probably since I was about 5 years old. And so this was a very deeply personal form of research and way to tell a story that I think is important in understanding not just Zimbabwe's history, but the history of colonialism, and what that actually means for people on the ground, right? We talk a lot, I think, as scholars about concepts like migration and colonialism in the abstract. I wanted to look at what it actually means from a bottom-up approach for people who are formerly colonized to move from one space to another. And a lot of times you hear discussions, especially in academia, about this concept of objectivity versus subjectivity, right? This idea that as scholars, we should always be objective. And I think that's something that, especially when you're coming from a community that you're researching and writing about and spending time with, you can't just sit there and say, well, I'm going to be fully objective. Sometimes leaning into your subjectivity is what makes your research important. It's what adds to histories that have been written by scholars who come from outside those communities. And I think blending both those perspectives together is something deeply important. And this sort of relates to a lot of debates. You might have heard this term in recent years, decolonization, right? We talk a lot about decolonizing the academy, decolonizing universities. But what does that actually mean in practice? And I think part of that, especially in a discipline like African history, which was dominated by British and American historians for so long, it's important to now have historians from Africa writing African history, and doing it not just in Africa, but in Western institutions as well. So some of the research methods and tools that I use. The first are more what we would call conventional, traditional modes of historical scholarship, which is going to government archives. Pictured here is the Zimbabwean National Archives. They are notoriously underfunded. I probably plagued them for about a year, coming in every day, asking for documents that people had not taken out in decades, questioning them when they couldn't find a particular document, and I think they eventually were like, you know what, just whatever you want, we'll give it to you. we're tired, we're done. But one of the really difficult things about doing research in the global south is that you have a lot of documents that are missing, and again, there isn't a lot of incentive sometimes to find those documents because they're underfunded, because the people who work there are so underpaid. And another huge difficulty, so I did research in 1 year while on a Fulbright in the United Kingdom and in Zimbabwe. In the United Kingdom, I could request up to 6 documents at a time. Once I returned those, I could get 6 more. I could order them the night before. They'd be sitting in a nice little locker for me. There'd be air conditioning. There was swans, you know, sort of in this little pond right outside the archives. I could take as many photos with my phone as I wanted, which for a researcher is deeply important. Zimbabwe, not so much. They are very, very territorial over their documents. And I actually had to pay 25 cents for every page that I scanned, which, thank goodness I had research money. But there's a lot of scholars, especially from Zimbabwean institutions, working in these archives who don't have that funding and have to actually just take notes with documents, right? They can't actually take photos of the actual documents. And so that's definitely a huge sort of liability, or at least a difficulty in trying to do research in these different spaces. These documents were often falling apart. One example in the middle over there is a photo of a census schedule. Now, this was a beautiful census schedule to me because I actually found my family in it. That is my maternal family that I all found. That's 2 generations of them in that census schedule. That is my great-grandfather's handwriting. So it was really beautiful to be able to find the schedule that they filled out. But a lot of them are missing or are sort of getting frayed and torn at the edges. And as much as, you know, the archivists there do a really good job of trying to protect documents, with age, a lot of these documents start to decay naturally as well. But I was able to create a database based on all the information I found in census records and put it into an Excel spreadsheet. So at least anyone from the community who wanted to trace their own history, this is research that's not just accessible to me, but is accessible to the rest of the community as well. I did research in the Library of the High Court of Zimbabwe as well. That is a page from a court case that became really important to a chapter in my book. It was about an Indian man, actually, who contested segregation. He was denied access to a white swimming pool in the 1960s in southern Rhodesia, and so took the municipality, the city of Salisbury, as it was then called, to the High Court to challenge his access. And actually in this court case, I discovered that they referenced Supreme Court judgments that you might be familiar with here, Brown versus Board, Atlanta versus Holmes. There's a whole legal conversation happening between the United States and southern Rhodesia at this time about what segregation meant. And this was a really seminal case that ended up being the center of one of my book chapters. I also did research in the United Kingdom, right, as I mentioned, in the very, very pretty archival building that they have. I did research in the British Library, which is another beautiful building, and in the parliamentary archives there as well. And finally, then, as one of our previous speakers spoke about, right, situations and contexts are always changing radically, and one huge difficulty I had to deal with was trying to do research in India during the pandemic. And so what I did was I reached out to archivists there. They were already digitizing their collections, and so for a fee, I think I paid $600 in total, they scanned every single document I wanted and sent that over to me, and it's now publicly available through their website. So again, sort of trying to pivot and figure out ways that you can keep doing your research, especially during a pandemic, always key. Another big sort of source that a lot of historians use and that I used were newspapers and magazines, right? So this included state newspapers. Pictured here in the middle, I have a page from the Rhodesia Herald. But of course, that is a newspaper that has a lot of state biases. It is the government-sponsored newspaper of the time. And so what you get from there are a lot of colonial perspectives as opposed to African and Indian perspectives, which is what I was looking for. And so what I did was sort of try and find their voices in more, in other publications where they were actually interviewed directly themselves. So on the right there is the cover from a magazine called Illustrated Life Rhodesia, where they interviewed Indians about what it meant to be living in Rhodesia, right? What it meant for them several generations on. And in that way, I'm able to find their voices. The same goes with government archives, right? A lot of times, these documents are produced by colonial institutions, but you can still dig through them to find the voices of people who were colonized, right? So that includes in things like court cases, in censuses, in letters that they might have written to the government. You can still find their voices even in these institutions. And I also worked with another magazine that was produced by the Indian community in the 1950s and 1960s. And it was actually printed in the outhouse of my great-grandfather's home because it was kind of an illicit publication. It wasn't legally outlawed, but the fact that it was being produced by non-white populations would have been frowned upon. And so they produced it very secretly in the back of his house. They bought their own printing press and created it. And from there, I was able to find every single edition of it at the home of a widow of one of the men who was involved with the publication, currently living in London. So I kind of had to go everywhere to find my sources and then try and piece them together. Another archive that I worked with was a community archive that I actually helped create myself. You'll find a lot of times that these are archives of documents that you're not going to find in a traditional archive. They're people's photographs, they're their immigration documents, their passports, newspaper clippings that they might have printed out and find important to them. Very, very deeply personal documents. And when I moved back home to Harare in 2014 and 2015, in between grad school, I was tasked with helping to create this archive. And so what we did was went door to door to each home of people we knew in the Indian community and collected their documents. And then I sat in a very dark room for 3 months with probably, I don't know, dozens of boxes of documents and cataloged and scanned them. And so this is an archive I now have access to, and one that, again, if you're doing research within your own community, is deeply important, because now you're getting documents from people themselves and not just relying on archives where their voices would be invisible. Photographs were another form of source for me, because they can tell you a lot about what's important to people when they're standing and posing for these photographs, right? There's a photograph there of my own grandparents, and you'll notice my grandfather's wearing a traditional Western suit, and my grandmother's in a sari. That tells me a lot about gender conceptions of the time, that men could be more westernized, whereas women were seen as being more traditional and had to stick to more traditional Indian clothing, as well as maintaining traditions and religion in the home as well. There's a photograph of a group of men there on the left. They are all men who were put into detention centers for resisting colonialism, including that same Indian man who led that court case against segregation. This is where all the pieces start coming together as well, right? And he was imprisoned with these men for about 5 to 6 years simply for resisting colonialism. And that's a photo there at the bottom of it's a trading store owned by an Indian businessman. This photo was taken in the 1940s. This was the main distributor of school uniforms because in former British colonies, most students wear school uniforms. And they were the main distributors, and that store still stands today on the exact same street in the exact same location. And so for me, that's a way to trace its origins and see how it's changed over time. Finally, the sort of last main form of source that a lot of African historians have to use are oral histories. Because again, a lot of times the voices of colonized people in the global south are missing from traditional archives. How we get around that is by actually talking to people themselves. And so there's a difference between sort of oral histories and oral traditions. Oral traditions are stories passed down from generation to generation. Oral histories are the stories told by people of their own lives. And a lot of times you find that they start blending together when you're doing these interviews, because people will start talking about their lives not from when they were born, but from when their first ancestor arrived in the country. And that is where sort of these two types of methodologies blend together, and you sort of have to parse between what's an oral history and what's an oral tradition. I was also able to rely on past oral histories done by my own mentor in Zimbabwe. He had done these interviews in the 1960s and 70s. He gave me all the tapes, and I had to dig out my old cassette recorder from when I was a child to listen to them and then transcribe them. It was a wild experience, and I was like, this is going back in time, quite literally, right? And there's a common misperception, right, that oral histories aren't as reliable as written sources, that they're more subject to bias, that they change over time, that they're not as based in fact and evidence, when in fact written sources can be subject to those exact same biases as well, right? So the goal lies in sort of putting them together and thinking through, right, what does it mean when I have an archival document talking about one thing and an oral history talking about another, right? How can they complement traditional archival research? And of course, there are ethics involved, right? I'm an insider doing interviews with a community that basically know me very well, right? How might their responses to me differ from someone who doesn't belong to that community? How can I treat their stories with respect? How can I tell them things that when they tell me something that might be factually incorrect, it's not my job to correct them, right? It is my job to listen to them and understand why they are telling me that version of a particular story. And finally, just thinking about oral histories as a genre, as a methodology, there are a lot of different ways to do it, right? There are more traditional surveys. There are more ethnographical styles of doing this. I like to start with a method I learned from another historian, which is where I have questions prepared, but I often just sit down and start an interview by saying, tell me about your life, and letting them take charge. And I find I often get a lot more from them than if I target my own questions and come in with my own preconceived notions and misconceptions. All right, I'm happy to answer questions later, but I wanted to wrap up and not take too much. Thank you.
Hello. First of all, I just want to thank y'all so much. I learned so much from all of these conversations and hearing everybody, each of you talk about your research. And one thing I'm curious about, because I think it came up in each of your projects, is that research question, right? How we come into the project with a question or what we're curious about. And I'm curious to know, Dr. Galemba mentioned this specifically, but how do those questions change? And what is the process through which each of you might evaluate that kind of research question as you're going through? Yeah.
Okay, I can start. When I think about my research question, when I started doing my PhD research back in 2017, so a long time ago, I actually came around full circle back to my original question. So I think I started with a question, I went out into the field, more questions cropped up, I changed what I thought was my main research question based on stuff I had found. Historians typically don't like going in with a preconceived thesis or hypothesis. We have to do it for grant applications because they make us do it. But oftentimes it's like just writing fiction, right? We're just like, okay, we're just gonna make something up, and if it changes, great. If it stays the same, wonderful. But whenever I teach research to my history students and the history majors, I say don't go in with a preconceived thesis. Go in with questions that you might have, and then let the evidence tell you what your thesis is. And that's what happened to me, right? Again, my questions evolve and change, but when I started revising my dissertation into a book, and then got feedback from external reviewers and started doing all of those revisions, the original question I'd gone in with immediately came back, right? So I think sometimes those questions do evolve and change. Sometimes you can go back full circle and realize that what you were trying to do at the beginning is what you should have been getting at all along. But that was my experience.
With me, I take my research questions, I go back and forth, I make them broad before I start executing the research project, just to give me that flexibility. And I do the same with when I advise honors thesis students. When I advise honors thesis students, it's like, I tell them the story when I was an undergrad, that it took me 2 months to find a research question. and I don't want any undergrads going through that again. So I asked them, like, think of a broad question for now, and as you keep reading and researching, then you start refining it to when you get to a point you feel like you could execute the project. And that's something that from my experience as well.
I'll just add briefly, I think it definitely is a disciplinary difference as well. So I was talking to a colleague who was saying they were really having trouble writing something because their argument didn't match their question. And I was like, so what's the problem? And because, again, that we're kind of similar, I think, in anthropology to like that kind of a starter. And I think what you brought up so beautifully is it doesn't have to come from the theory or from a topic, but also from your embodied lived experience, right? A research question and even theory can come from that as well. But sometimes it's a good starting point where I got down to the Mexico-Guatemala border and I thought I was going to study migration, and then I go, that's kind of like a very small piece of what's going on. But then I was interested in like what I thought or had read about, like the increasing restrictions, right, mobility or securitization of the border with like these talks of free trade, and then people were like, correct me, like, what are you talking about, more security? It just opened up like this whole can of worms of what that actually meant, because it meant something totally different. So it actually was a better question in terms of opening up why it was misplaced rather than answering a question.
We have time for more questions.
I had a question kind of directed towards Dr. Jesse. What kind of quantitative processes did you go through when you were researching, and how did you were saying that you had to change your samples because you couldn't get like the original sample that you wanted. How did those processes work, and how did it kind of differ then to the other sort of research processes that we saw, or that they talked about?
Okay, so like for the Honduras one, I wanted a nationally representative sample, but this was the context. It was COVID, so COVID and high levels of political violence in Honduras at the time. So we went back and forth with my colleagues in Honduras. It was like, what's the best we can do for the safety of the respondent, the enumerators, and for the project? So it was like a few weeks of discussion on where the sample should be, and we wanted to make sure that the sample was such that even if it's not nationally representative, we could still test our hypotheses and research questions. And this is something that I don't want to speak for all the social sciences, but something in political science have definitely embraced, that because of COVID, we learned that we're not going to get perfect samples. Most samples are convenient samples anyway. And it's just kind of, okay, if you're anticipating this sample, recognize the limitations of the study ahead of time. That way, when you're analyzing the data, you know what you could infer and not infer. In the Salvadoran case, I mean, it's such a small country, so that helps. So we were able to get a national representative sample for that. But yeah, so there's a lot of like, you gotta think of like the big picture of the project before you deep dive into the numbers. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. And how do you think that differed from taking like oral history samples and like gathering different, like how do you think that the research and data collection differed from if you had taken a different approach? And
okay, so I think the goal for me, and I think Professor Galemba nailed it, is I was interested in the causal effects.
Mm-hmm.
The things I want to measure are the quantifiable effect of migration on the outcome on a large sample, to see on average how do people respond. And so the trade-off is I can't really get at the mechanism, but I was okay with that because, I actually read, my favorite articles are ethnographies, because they inform me of the mechanisms, and I try to take that into account when I do my survey research.
thanks.
I had to say, this is for everybody on the panel, but How do you guys deal with writer's block?
Try.
The way I deal with it is I turn off the computer and I just get a piece of paper and I just write anything that comes from writing with my hands. And then I start making an outline or filtering based on what I wrote on a piece of paper. Then I open my computer.
So I wrote this book during COVID home with my kids, so it's like, I think if anything, I was like, just anything else to keep me busy was good, so that's a great example. But something I've often found helpful is, like, if you really need to stop, like, think about, like, what's blocking you, and I actually calendar that in for my next writing session, be like, this is where I left off, and these are the questions I have, and this is what's blocking me, and so then I can actually move myself forward. But I also always used to recommend this book called Writing Your Dissertation in 15 Minutes a Day, and, like, nobody can do that, but I think it's, like, to develop just write something, like, write your grocery list, like, write anything, so just, like, a habit of writing, I think, can sometimes help.
My easy answer to that is I just don't write that day. There are some days you wake up and you know it is not a writing day. You just know nothing creative is going to come from you. It is not going to be good, and so I pivot to doing other work, right? What does help that happen less often is having a really good outline, which is why all my students for all their papers have to show me an outline. If I have an outline where I have my steps put in, I have all my sources put in, I know exactly what I'm going to be doing, then I have a plan. So even if I'm sitting there and I'm like, I really don't know what I'm doing next, go back to the outline. It'll tell me what I'm doing next. So I can avoid those days where I wake up and I'm like, today's not a writing day.
Thank you.
So something I noticed that all three of you touched on a little bit is like the kind of personal aspects you all have to your research. So I guess my question is, how do you balance that, like putting yourself kind of into your writing and into your research, but also, you know, staying kind of like outside because it is kind of important to be maybe more impartial. I'm just wondering how you would balance that.
I use the footnotes for that. That's another one of my easy answers is if I'm ever talking about a relative or someone who's close to me, I put that in the footnote. So at least that way I'm addressing my personal connection to it, but I'm not inserting myself into the text either. And I think it's this balance you have to maintain between being an insider, and that actually gives you an advantage because if you know these people, they will be more honest with you, they will tell you more, they'll feel more comfortable being their most vulnerable and honest selves compared to if I'm not a member of this community, right? And then it's sort of, I feel like I want to be an insider during the interview, but an outsider when I'm writing about it, so that I can take a step back, put everything together, piece it with the other archival sources that I have, and then try and come up with a narrative that's comprehensive, that again strikes that balance between trying to be both.
Yeah, I would say actually for me it depends what I'm writing. I think more like article writing, I've probably more approached it. I think actually a lot of ethnography is moving this way where it's like you kind of put it all out there. I mean, you put yourself in there. I mean, not to a point where it's about you, but that I think I write about that actually a lot in the book because I thought that was actually really important for people to know. My students are in the book. They all have permission when their names are used. And some of them are co-authors of a chapter in the book where we talk about those issues in the book. And it comes out more in different parts, of course. But, you know, I talk about like the juxtaposition of like doing this kind of work, like in my own city as, you know, a white, person with lots of privilege, right? And a woman doing this kind of work, and then, you know, being on the street corner with workers in the morning, and then like teaching my class in the afternoon, like taking my kids to gymnastics at night. Like, we should problematize that. Like, that's right. That's kind of what the book is about. Like, inequality, and if we're not part of that conversation, I think we're obscuring a lot of what we can learn from it. And so those parts of the book are very transparently integrated into the book, including some of the roles of students in the book and kind of the ethical issues of just doing this kind of work. So it's in there, but I would have to say that I did write this book after I already had tenure, which some people also, some of my junior colleagues do struggle with. But for the topic I was writing about and because of who I am, I thought it was important to at least like have that in there so people can evaluate that for themselves.
I think I take a different approach. I hide. I don't really, I do my best not to show any of my personal in my research. So the way I've done, and I do this with teaching sometimes as well, and the way I've done this is that research is a conversation with someone or some other field. So for example, with this project on abortion, which I personally invested in, I'm speaking to a literature in sociology about how immigrants think about the context they live in. There are theories about, do immigrants carry what they've learned as young adults before migrating? So what I do is I frame it to the broader theoretical discussion at hand. And I think this is just like me, like I'm just trying to protect myself, because like given who I am, I don't want someone to say your personal biases are in there. So I really built this shield of, well, what is this research actually about? Who am I talking to? So that way, the project is more about inserting itself in a broader discussion about whether it's politics, immigration, or whatever. So I think that's just my personality. Like I am personally, I'm like passionate about these projects, but I do hide, and I'm the same with teaching. And I think that's just kind of my position, given who I am.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have about 7 minutes.
One more question? I have a question. I'm excited to ask. You all were mentioning, when research works or when you have findings. So, I know in my very specific area, but I would love to hear it across your different areas, how you know when you have findings or you've answered your research question.
I mean, I try to frame it as like, even if I don't have a finding, it's still important. I think that's something that political science is getting better at in the last few years, is that it's not just about whether you got the finding, it's also about why didn't you get the finding, and relating it back to like the hypothesis test and the research and the framing and that. So I think that's something that's quite new in political science research in the last decade, is this kind of like, null findings are important too. To make them important, you gotta tell us why they're important.
There used to be this saying in ethnography, and it was Malinowski, and I forget the exact parameters, but I think it was kind of instructive, where he's like, enough research is like ethnography is like 3 days or 30 years. Like it's sort of this crazy kind of discrepancy, but I think it is really hard because you can always be finding more and doing more, and I have that problem. But for me, I kind of know of like when you get it, like when you start to hear the same things kind of happening, and yes, you might be surprised occasionally or get contradictions, but you can explain those, right, and why they're happening. Sometimes though, I felt like, it's, at least for me, like when I feel like I can tell like the particular story, right, about the topic that I'm interested in, but then sometimes, for many people, like time to start writing just has to do with pure time, right, or, funding limitations, but it is important to set some parameters on, like for us, it's like how much research is enough before you have something to say. But yeah, I think that when you feel like you can kind of explain what's going on, even when it surprises you.
I feel like I find answers to questions sometimes that I didn't know I was questioning. That definitely happens during a writing process when you're combing through your sources again after some distance from them, and you're like, wait, hold on, I should have been asking this question the entire time, and this is the sort of pattern or trend or thing that I'm finding. And then there's those moments where you have a very obvious question and it jumps up to you in the archives, which happened to me in London actually, and I was sitting with a friend who was doing research with me, and I jumped in the air and squealed and gave her the fight of her life. And it ended up then being a question that wasn't important to the final book. But at the time I was so excited that I found the answer to this, and I had the very good problem of having too much research, of having way too many sources, and then having to figure out, right, what direction am I taking with this? I have drained every single source I can find of the juice I can get from it. Now what do I do with it? And there's so much I had to cut and take away, and that's becoming other research projects or going into something else. I call it my little graveyard folder. It's where things I had to cut they go to die, but maybe we can revive them later on. So I think that process is really fluid, and it just changed wildly over time.
I guess we have about maybe several minutes.
I just had one very, very short question. I mean, it could be long, but please answer shortly. So we teach writing, so when you have all of this data from archives, from interviews, from surveys, what are some of the biggest challenges of what to actually put into a text for an audience? And what do you have to end up, throwing out, not using? What are some of your writing processes?
I'm going to go back to outlines, big fan of them. And sometimes what I find myself doing when I need to cut is taking a chapter, re-outlining it, reorganizing the outline, then going back and redoing the writing. And I think having that fluid process helps, and also writing your introduction last.
Mm-hmm.
I know it sounds odd, but do everything else, do your body, do your conclusion, and then come back to introduction.
I'm having this problem right now, so again, it doesn't go away no matter how old you get, where I have way too much data in a paper I'm writing because I'm like, I love it all, I can't take it out. And I think for me, I'm actually less of an outline person, but I should be one. For me, it's about I find the narrative arc of either the book or the chapter or the article, and then thinking about what best shows these points, or are there other points I'm not using, right? Or or not covering, right? And then what best supports that, I think is helpful with that, but I still struggle with it.
A strategy that I've been doing is, what could I write in 2 pages? I was like, okay, I got 2 pages to explain what I've done. Yep. Because that forces me to just keep the most important stuff there. Then I grow from there. Same when I outline. If my outline starts to exceed 3 pages, I was like, okay, I gotta stop and redo it again, and I got 2 pages. And that's something that I've been doing with my students as well. It's like, okay, we've covered 5 weeks of course material. Here's a response, here's a prompt. You have 3 pages. Go over, you're penalized. Because I think what that helps is that it forces kind of your brain to really make a decision, and that's the hardest part of writing. Is not just it's not really the writing. There's a decision-making process of what's going in this paper. So I feel like when you kind of force that choice, I think it really helps kind of filter and make you decide what's important for this project. But that's my style, so maybe people disagree.
Well, I make a mess and I clean up and then you have a graveyard.
I don't like cleaning up.
My writing process is organized chaos. That's 100% what it is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for sitting. I hope you all learned a little something. You did a lot of good work. I always find myself wanting to read the things you all are talking about, and then I go back and get them, and it's kind of exciting. So, I do know that there are some cookies at the back. If you were not deserted as you should have been, please help yourself to those cookies. There's still some water and lemonade. Thank you again to our panel, and y'all have a great evening.